Now, this statement was sandwiched by Rachel Reeves saying that we are living in a time of increased global uncertainty. This was presumably a way for her to justify not only the increase in defence spending, but also what you've characterised in the New Statesman as grim pain. Growth has halved, welfare has been cut, defence is hoovering up more and more, although some would say not as much as we need to be spending on it even so. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the statement in this episode, but first I want to ask you, can the Chancellor really blame all this on global external factors?
Good question. I think there are two things that are not true. The Conservatives say it's all her fault, not true. She says it's all everybody else's fault, not true. There are two kinds of blame to be allocated. One is the big picture stuff, which is the inheritance, first of all. The fact that if you listen to Labour rhetoric, this is the growth economy. She's asked at the time of the election, what is Labour Party's strategy? What is Labour Party policy? And she says two words, economic growth. But it's as if they thought that they were inheriting a great kind of Shire horse, which is going to pull the country forward. And in fact, all they got was a kind of winded, spayed, broken down donkey that was exhausted. And that is the problem they have. So the rhetoric of we're going to have growth was overblown. But of course, she inherited an economy that was on its knees, debilitated by COVID, debilitated by the inflationary effects of the Ukraine war, all of that. And now she has Donald Trump eyeing tariffs just across the Atlantic. So none of that is her fault. Any government would be struggling at this point. However, she also did put national insurance contributions onto business, and it's pretty clear that has had a big effect on cutting back hiring and investment at just the wrong time. I think she thought that underlying business confidence with a new Labour government was much stronger than it has proved to be. In other words, she thought, I can load a bit more onto business, a bit more taxes onto business, and it will be fine. The early indications is that it's not fine. Add to that her, as it were, talking down the economy in the first weeks and months of her chancellorship. That was also a mistake. So I think there are, as it were, near-at-hand mistakes which she has made, and frankly, I think she ought to acknowledge. And then there's the big picture, which matters much more and isn't her fault.
On the question of how much of it is Rachel Reeves' fault and how much is sort of the global factors, what do you think the public think? How much sympathy is she getting for her position from the public?
What we know from the polling is the public think two things, which might not be completely consistent, and that is the public for you.
The British public being inconsistent.
First of all, they think the welfare system is generally not strict enough. They like the idea of tightening tightening access to welfare. And second, they really hate the idea of taking money away from people who are genuinely sick and disabled. I think this week the argument has changed. Up to now, as we have discussed on the podcast before, Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, was completely able to argue that her reforms to the welfare system were about a broken benefit system with far too many people coming on very, very early in life for a possible lifetime on incapacity benefit. No country can afford it. She had to sort it out. And work is a progressive Labour value and all of that. And I think that was an argument the public probably bought up to now. What's happened this week is that by halving and then freezing the health element of universal credit, that's for people who have already been decided to be too sick or too disabled to work properly. For the rest of this decade, the freeze goes on. I think that was just a straightforward cut to people who are already, many of them, in very great poverty. And I think that's much, much harder to justify. And I think it all adds up to what I would call a crisis for social democracy in this country. The notion that you can have a progressive tax system, that you've got an economy strong enough to support the people at the bottom who most deserve it, that is now being questioned, I think, this week.
Well, we also got the impact assessments from the welfare changes that were announced last week. I think maybe the government were hoping to slip those out and they might get lost in the general news around the Spring Statement. Obviously, they haven't been lost. And what we have learned is that more than 3 million families will lose out financially as a result of cuts to welfare benefits by 2030, amounting to an average loss of £1,720 a year. And we also have impact assessments that suggest it would drive 250,000 more people into poverty, including 50,000 children.
To me, that is the headline, 250,000 people driven into poverty by the end of this Labour government, plus 50, including 50,000 children from a government which made ending child poverty absolutely central to its moral purpose. This seems to me to be a very, very bleak moment for Labour indeed.
And it was a sort of last-minute change, some of those benefit changes, because the OBR didn't score the Treasury's welfare changes as highly as the Treasury wanted them to, and so they were forced to sort of make last-minute changes.
We know it came late. We know that Rachel Reeves had left herself a relatively small percentage, £9.5 billion so-called headroom or wriggle room, and that had vanished because of lower growth and so on. And that she had to work fast to restore that. It's exactly the same figure, £9.5 billion, at the end of this Parliament, as she's lost at the moment. But we also know that all these numbers are very, very flaky. We don't really believe the OBR about these numbers.
The OBR doesn't believe.
And the OBR doesn't believe it. The OBR itself said that depending on what Trump decides to do next Wednesday, 6 days from now, none of these figures may be appropriate. And the extra room that Rachel Reeves has bought herself by hitting welfare again might just vanish like that. Now, therefore, we've had this, build up, the great big fiscal statement, the Spring Statement, though I say it should be thought more as a midwinter statement, being so cold and hard and dark. But we've had this great moment based on figures which may not last for a week.
Well, may not last for 24 hours, in fact, because we got the news overnight that the Trump White House is announcing 25% tariffs on all cars built outside the US. Now, we know that there are back-channel conversations going on, and the UK is hoping for some kind of exemption or that it will be softened in some way. But about 17% of UK car exports went to the US last year, about 120,000. Has that thrown the Chancellor's numbers out already? And that comes before the extra tariffs that we're expecting next week.
Now, you're pushing my expertise on the global automotive industry to its limits there, Rachel. But I think the answer is not really. I don't think we export that many cars to the United States to the extent that it will hit the big numbers about growth. It's bad, but it's a small hit. What really matters is the much wider possible tariffs coming on Wednesday.
Okay, but either way, it's
it ain't good news.
It's not great for the government when hours after a big fiscal statement like this, we get news from the Trump White House that throws all the numbers out again.
But we come back to why I think even now we can feel some sympathy for Rachel Reeves, because she is Chancellor of a social democratic government, or one that wants to think of itself as social democratic, or slightly left, or however you characterize it, at a time when the global headwinds have never been fiercer or more unpredictable. To any chancellor looking at what Trump is going to do to the world economy and the impossibility of second-guessing Trump day by day by day would be in deep, deep trouble. That is not her fault.
Well, she also tried to be optimistic in as much as she could be. And the main positive thing that she tried to put forward yesterday was the housing targets and the fact that the OBR have finally scored the planning reforms in terms of the growth that they're expected to drive by the end of the Parliament. We spoke last week about whether they were on track to meet their 1.5 million new homes by the end of the Parliament. It seems that they've lowered this slightly to 1.3 million, but they're getting there. 1.3 million houses is better than no houses.
So I spoke to somebody from the Treasury about all of this in the last couple of days, who made the following point, which is if you really want to drive fast house building, the new powers and the new system the government has given itself is probably not strong enough. In other words, there is still quite a lot of local discretion. And if you really want to do it, you would say to every local authority in the country, here is your target. In this area, 5,000 new houses, come back within 6 months or 6 weeks and tell us where they're going to go. But no ifs, no buts, they're going. And actually, the government needed to be tougher and more centralised and more aggressive at the centre if it's going to hit those targets. Second thing is, a lot of this is based on new towns. I love new towns. I love the idea of new towns. But new towns require quite a lot of infrastructure going in. They require, the reservoirs, they require the pipes, the tubes, eventually the roads and all of that. And connections to the grid. That takes a long time. So those bits of the new building project are not going to actually happen until the end of this Parliament.
So keep scoring the government's house building efforts, but we're not there yet. After Rachel Reeves delivered the statement, we heard from Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, who delivered his response. Kind of what you'd expect. He called her reckless. He said she tanked the economy. He called it an emergency budget, which is a line that Kemi Badenoch has been trying really hard to make stick. I was watching his response, and other than a sort of a lot of contempt, I didn't really get the core point of what he was arguing. What did you think of his response?
I thought he was rhetorically quite strong. He's becoming a more and more powerful performer as an individual politician. But the truth is that a Conservative government, had things gone differently last July and we had somehow still got a Conservative government, they would be doing much the same.
They'd be in exactly
right
the same
now.
mess.
Exactly. And although, he says rightly they got inflation down to target 2%, more or less at the time of the election, that was after a very, very long period of high inflation, and it was after a period of really, really poor underinvestment in public services. And their own plans going forward were completely incredible. There were a series of bombs, as it were, put in every single spending department to go off because they thought they weren't going to win the election. So they would have been in just as bad, if not worse, a position themselves, and they know it.
And of course, a lot of the issues that the Treasury finds itself in go back to Jeremy Hunt's 2p cut in national insurance, which you can argue Labour shouldn't have agreed to commit to.
Well, you raise, I think, the other legitimate criticism of Rachel Reeves and indeed Keir Starmer, which is, did they really need to make those promises quite so all-embracing on tax at the time of the election? To say that you weren't going to touch national insurance or VAT or income tax. Now, they have touched national insurance, and Paul Johnson of the IFS says they quite clearly broke their election promises, so they haven't even got that defence to come back on. But I think at the very, very least, they should have said these national insurance changes proposed by Jeremy Hunt are unaffordable, and if we're elected, we're not going to go ahead with them.
Just one thing that I noticed about Rachel Reeves' rhetoric is she repeatedly referred to the parties opposite, not to the party opposite, which is how governments usually refer to the opposition, but the parties opposite. And that just caught my eye, caught my ear, because we are dealing with a parliament that, yes, Labour have a huge landslide majority, but the electorate is quite fractured. You've got strong opposition in some areas coming from the Lib Dems, who are the third largest party. You've got really fierce challenge to Labour coming in terms of the media from Reform, with its used to be 5, now 4 MPs. How significant do you think that is, that we're now looking at sort of opposition parties as opposed to one? Or is that just a rhetorical flourish of Rachel Reeves?
Good question, because I think the real crucial bit there is the Liberal Democrats. What I'm hearing is that at the moment, according to pollsters, certainly around the south, Labour are losing far fewer voters to Reform than they are to the Liberal Democrats. And I think the Liberal Democrats are going to have a very strong performance in the local elections coming up. They too, of course, have some big economic questions to answer, because an awful lot of their responses to Labour on things like welfare and the NHS and caregivers and care homes being a particular interest of Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, they would fund an awful lot of this with big taxes on the tech companies. And going after, the Amazons of this world and the Metas and the so forth, which sounds great. There is a huge amount of money just waiting to be squeezed, and we can transform everything. But as we have seen, we are now facing a United States led by a president who is in lockstep with the big American tech companies and is going to be fighting very, very hard. So the Liberal Democrat proposals, and of course Ed Davey's own rhetoric about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the rest of it, would produce a much more aggressive response from the United States, which, as a relatively small economy, we could not afford.
Last question before you go, Andrew. Will Rachel Reeves have to raise taxes in autumn?
I think the short answer to your question, Rachel, is yes. The Conservatives kept saying this was an emergency budget. Had it been an emergency budget, I think this time round they'd have had to raise some taxes. All I can say is I hope if and when they do raise taxes in October, they raise taxes on people like me and not people who can't afford to wear a decent set of clothes or eat properly or have a decent roof over their heads.
OK, Rachel Reeves, if you're listening, more taxes on Andrew Marr, please.